Who will find what the finders hide? Part 2. To understand the finders, we need to examine the people involved in the day-to-day activities of the cult. More specifically, to find what the finders hide, it's imperative to study the founder of the group, Marion Petty. The following details are taken from the public record on Petty, as well as interviews with members of the finders. Who was Marion Petty? Little is known about the life of Marion D. Petty, the mysterious founder of the finders. Before his death in 2004, it had been widely reported that Petty was a retired Air Force Master Sergeant who spent years rubbing elbows with the top brass and the United States intelligence community. The true nature of Petty's connections to these intelligence agencies remains a central mystery to the case of the Finders cult. After the Tallahassee arrests in 1987, the New York Times referred to Petty as a, quote, charismatic leader who urged his followers to study a doctrine that stressed self-exploration and futurism, end quote. During the investigation, Priscilla Coates, president of the Bay Area chapter of the Cult Awareness Network, told the Associated Press that the Finders were not a satanic cult, but rather, quote, just a weird situation where Petty controlled others and made everything a game. Media reports from the 1980s state that the Finders first evolved out of the human potential movement of the 1970s, a movement based on the idea that an extraordinary potential lie within each person, waiting to be unleashed. Petty, who was also known as the student, the stroller, the pathfinder, or the game caller, claims that he had been hosting parties and gatherings of like-minded people since the 1930s. In a 1996 interview with the Washington City paper and a 1998 interview with Steam Shovel Press, Marion Petty discussed his early years. Quote, I've been keeping open house to fools since the 30s. I rented 2 apartments in Washington and had open house. Anyone that wanted could come and stay with me. I'm still doing it. End quote. In fact, Petty told both the Steam Shovel Press and the Washington City paper that since World War I, he kept open house, quote, mainly to intelligence and counterintelligence people in Washington, end quote. Petty claimed that his goal was to know everything and say nothing. Quote, I run a private intelligence game and I send people out undercover to find out various things. I've been investigating the CIA before it was the CIA, when it was the OSS, Petty stated in reference to the predecessor of the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services. In 1998, Petty told the Steam Shovel Press that in the 1960s, investigators were monitoring him for 4 years. He claimed that the investigators accused him of being a drug dealer and then a front for the CIA. However, Petty claimed that eventually the investigators left him alone. Petty also stated that he tried all of his life to get behind the scenes in the CIA. Quote, I sent my wife in as a spy to spy on the CIA for me. She was very happy about it, happy to tell me everything she found out. She was in a key place, with the records, and she could find out things for me. And my son worked for Air America, which was a propriety of the CIA. There are some connections, but not to me personally, end quote. It is true that Petty's wife worked for the CIA and that one of his sons worked for Air America, a CIA front accused of trafficking opium. Despite his long-term interest in intelligence agencies and his family members' involvement with intelligence agencies, Petty swears he himself is not a member of the intelligence community. However, further details of Petty's involvement with U.S. intelligence services were revealed in the late 1980s. In 1994, journalist Daniel Brandt wrote an article titled Marion Petty and His Washington, D.C. Finders, Kooks or Spooks, detailing a meeting with 2 members of the Finders back in 1984. Brandt says at that time they were going by the name The Information Bank. 3 years later, Brandt was sent a 3-page memo titled Investigative Leads of Unknown Origin, which outlined Marion Petty's alleged intelligence links. Although the source of the memo remains anonymous, some of the data has been independently verified. According to the memo, in 1939, Petty met a Chinese agent operating under journalistic cover and remained in close contact with him throughout World War II. Petty began his intelligence career by working with various OSS contacts. After the war, Petty's Chinese contact introduced him to Charles Marsh at the National Press Club. Marsh was a journalist connected to LBJ and FDR and often suspected of ties to the CIA. The memo alleges that in 1946, while Petty was working as a chauffeur to General Ira Aker, Marsh arranged for him to be trained in counterintelligence. Petty received intelligence training at Georgetown University in 1956 and was sent to U.S. Air Force Intelligence Training School in Frankfurt, Germany. Through Marsh, Petty got his wife a job with the CIA from 1957 to early 1961. The memo states that Petty's handler was Colonel Leonard N. Wagner. Wagner advised Petty to resign from the military and surround himself with kooks so that he could infiltrate the Beat, Human Potential, and New Age movements. Wagner encouraged Petty to recruit people from youth hostels and universities. Petty was also instructed to recruit a network of agents in Europe. In the 1960s, Petty apparently fulfilled this mandate by making connections with the Beat movement. The memo also alleges that Petty penetrated the Human Potential movement by setting up Ken Casey, the famous novelist and countercultural figure, as a prominent guru. Finally, the memo claims that in 1979, Petty recruited John J. Cox, a computer specialist and founder of General Scientific, a computer firm specializing in classified defense contracts. Cox trained several of Petty's finders in computer programming and communications technologies. From the 1980s on, the finders claimed they used Petty's international network and cutting-edge computer technology to perform acts of freelance journalism for finders' fees. They deny any allegations of child trafficking, Satanism, or intelligence operations. So what exactly were the finders, and what were they finding? Researcher Wendell Minnick, author of Spies and Provocateurs, an encyclopedia of espionage and covert action, said he spent 2 years researching the finders, but after running up $1,000 in phone bills and running into too many dead ends, he concluded his investigation without much new information. Quote, "The finders would love you to think they're a CIA front, but I would say they're really nothing. You're going to hear a lot of bullshit on the finders, because they lie. These are dysfunctional adults, but they're all working their asses off. They're constantly working on some project. If you have a cult, the best way to control people is to keep them busy, to keep their minds occupied. If you have people standing around doing nothing, then they start thinking." End quote. To learn more about Marion Petty, the finders, and their relationship with the intelligence community, I sat down with longtime spokesman for the finders, Robert Toby Terrell. Terrell wrote a book about his experiences with the finders called The Game Caller, featuring one of the few known pictures of Marion Petty.
Toby Terrell, T-O-B-E-T-E-R-R-E-L-L. That's my real name. My legal name that I was born with is Robert Gardner Terrell, Jr. I worked for the IRS for 9 years and then left and went on my own and made enough money that I was able to retire at age 35. And I found by that time that I had done everything that my culture had programmed me to do. I was basically programmed to participate in the existing culture and make money and get a wife and 2 kids and move to the suburbs and then move into a bigger house and all of those kind of things. But that didn't seem to satisfy some deeper urge.
Terrell talks of meeting Marion Petty through a mutual friend and being invited to come visit the community that Petty called the New Ark.
One thing led to another, and I went back to visit him again and realized that he was a spiritual teacher. Based on the questions that he asked me. And so I asked him some questions as well. And then I was in transition. I'd been married for 12 years, had a couple of kids, was living in Chevy Chase in a very nice house in a very nice suburb. But it was a phase in my life where it was time to develop my spiritual nature. I'd been a householder, and that was a good phase. So to make that a shorter story, I moved in to the New Ark and never moved out.
Terrell embraced the finder's life, and after a divorce from his wife, he put his life savings into the Invisible Bank, a communal fund where everyone was allowed to contribute and take as they needed. Using these funds, Terrell helped Petty purchase the finder's properties in D.C. for the group's daily activities. He describes life in the finders as a constant game where Petty encouraged members to live one day at a time. The group was ran by Petty, and everyone submitted to his rules. Terrell said every day the finders would ask Petty to be the game caller, and then the group would follow his instructions.
He would say something like, okay, take off with no money and don't come back till you have $100. and no instructions other than that. And then you just leave and do whatever it took to get $100. Not that we were trying to get the $100, it was trying to get the experience.
Terrell confirmed that Marion Petty spent his military career working closely with generals and intelligence officials, and that Petty worked as a chauffeur.
He already knew the first chauffeur, and that's where he'd gotten the information about the new chauffeur's job. And he said that he just stood there and gazed into the eyes of Henry Arnold until Henry Arnold consented. And that's how he spent World War II, as the chauffeur for all of the leading generals of World War II, which was a wonderful job because he knew what was going on behind the scenes. He was carrying the vice president or these various generals around town in the back seat of his Cadillac. And during this time, he was a thrifty guy, and he'd saved up his money and began buying land in the Virginia mountains, which was very cheap at that time. So he had accumulated 600 acres of land on a chauffeur's salary, which is no easy feat. So when finders came together, he contributed that 600 acres of land, and I contributed the cash from. They had some cash already, but that was my contribution.
While Terrell claims that Petty bought the land by being thrifty and saving his chauffeur's salary, the anonymous investigative leads memo claims that it was in fact Charles Marsh who supplied the funds to Petty so he could purchase hundreds of acres of farmland in Madison and Rappahannock counties in Virginia. This is where Petty would start building his cult. During the research for this film, I was sent an interview with Finders member Michael Houlihan, aka Michael Howell, one of the men arrested in Tallahassee in 1987. In the interview, Howell emphatically states that the children were not abused, there were no blood rituals or satanic activity. Both Howell and Robert Terrell state that the Tallahassee incident was the result of a moral panic of the 1980s and bad reporting by the media. Terrell says the trouble began when a disgruntled ex-girlfriend of one of the finders went to the police and spread false rumors about the group's alleged involvement in satanic activity.
And she went to the D.C. police and told them that we were a satanic cult. And so they opened an investigation. I don't know what a satanic cult is, or even whether it's against the law. As evidence of the fact that we were a satanic cult, she took a police officer into the park. Our apartment buildings were right next to Glover Archibald Park, which is a 400-acre park in downtown D.C. It's a wonderful place. And if you walk out the back door of our apartment buildings, you walk onto a trail in Glover Archibald Park, and she took the police officer there and showed him that there was a circle of stones where someone had had a campfire. And this was the evidence that we were a satanic cult, that we had campfires. It was not us. I mean, I don't know where that came from, but that was enough evidence for them to open an investigation.
This original investigation mentioned by Terrell preceded the 1987 arrests in Tallahassee. It was the arrests of the two Finders men which spurred on a further investigation by the D.C. Metro Police, the U.S. Customs Agency, the Virginia State Police, and the FBI.
You have to have a little more background of what was happening in the culture at that time. There was a panic going on at that time. Now, what's going on now is that people are seeing a terrorist behind every bush. At that time, it was people were seeing child molesters behind every bush. There were many cases that got great publicity throughout the country. There was a whole industry that was built up around identifying child molesters, most of which amounted to nothing. There was a famous case out in Manhattan Beach in California that made national headlines for months. And finally, it all came down that it was all made up stuff that was put into the heads of these very young children. We were pioneers in trying to raise free children. And in order to do that, you have to be sort of clandestine, because if it looks like the children are not being raised in an orthodox fashion, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. And we certainly were not raising our children in orthodox fashion. We never gave them an order. We gave them a level of freedom that children in this culture don't have. We raised them in a non-threatening environment in the country where they would be close to nature. And on occasion they would come into the city, so but most of the time was spent in the country. And so the police were aware of us. They couldn't figure out what we were doing. We'd bought this 10,000 square foot warehouse, and we would sometimes appear there in the middle of the night, and it just didn't fit any pattern. All concluded that we were filming pornographic stuff, which couldn't have been further from the truth, but that's what they concluded. And one reason that they concluded that was that we had some cameras and high-tech equipment. The high-tech equipment that you're referring to, this was way back before there was an internet. We were pioneers on the internet. It was called MCI Mail. It was the first email system.
Terrell dismisses the 1993 reports from U.S. News and World Report and reports filed by U.S. Customs Agent Raymond Martinez.
Well, I'm aware of that. That's what was published in U.S. News and World Report. Very poor investigators. They took the word of a guy who was discredited in the and had been fired for other reasons in the customs, and that was absolutely crazy, and he had no evidence for it. It was just something that he said. You know, if you're an investigator sent out to get information, you don't just say it, you get evidence. Well, his evidence was that he had seen some communication from Hong Kong saying something about buying children or some absurd thing like that. And that was his interpretation of a kind of communication that he knew nothing about. We had a couple of guys. By that time, we had evolved an organization that traveled around the world doing journalism. And we had two different people who worked for Hong Kong News doing freelance articles, usually high-tech articles. And they happened to be in Hong Kong when the whole thing came down. And we communicated back and forth. We developed a number of shortcut ways of communicating. So I have no idea what he read that led him to conclude that there was some kind of a kidnapping going on. But he did say that, and so it was picked up by U.S. News and World Report. It just so happened that I was working at U.S. News and World Report at the time. Very poor investigator.
As we have shown, former Customs Agent Raymond Martinez has stated that he stands by his reports. Terrell not only dismisses the child trafficking claims, but also initially dismisses the idea that Petty maintained any contact to the U.S. intelligence agencies after he left the military.
They offered him a chance to become an intelligence officer. He took it, and they trained him in Europe for some period of time. And then his time was up. His 20 years in the military was up. And he resigned from the military and started his spiritual practice.
As far as you know, did he maintain any of those intelligence contacts?
He severed all ties with the intelligence community. He had been trained, but he never was assigned. When his training was over, he flew back to Washington and approached General Ira Aker, who was then the Secretary of the Air Force. And he told General Aker that he had instructions to please give him his honorable discharge. And he was highly regarded by Aker. So Aker asked him why, and Petty said, "I'm sorry, it's so secret that I can't even tell you." And Aker gave him the discharge, and he then severed all connections with the military. And none of this, I mean, it's absurd to think that we had any connection with anything governmental. We did not.
But is it possible that, you know, the games and the information that he was feeding the rest of the group were coming from somewhere else?
No, it's not possible. I mean, I shared the same toothbrush with this guy for 20 years. It's not possible. And you think about it. We were as opposite to the goals of the government and the intelligence community than you could possibly be.
Interestingly, members of the Finders are still connected to the intelligence field. This includes Kristen K. Noth, one of the mothers of the children involved in the 1987 Tallahassee incident. Noth has used several variations of her names over the years, including Kristen Noth and Kristen K. Noth. She has also written for various publications which discuss issues important to the intelligence community, including Knowledge Magazine and Foresight Alliance. Her LinkedIn page describes her as a futurist and qualitative analyst who has been deeply engaged with foresight practice and theory for more than 15 years. Eventually, Robert Terrell concedes that Petty was deeply connected to the intelligence community.
Did you ever see any evidence of Petty being tied to intelligence agencies? Because there are those who speculate, perhaps you're correct, perhaps the child trafficking claims, that was all exaggerated, it's part of the satanic moral panic of the 80s and that sort of thing. But there does seem to be some sort of indication that Petty was involved with intelligence services. Do you know anything about those claims, or did he ever share any of that information with you?
Oh, of course. He was in the Army Air Corps, which became, after World War II, the U.S. Air Force. And he was highly regarded by the brass. And they asked him if he would like to become an intelligence officer. So why would he want to be an intelligence officer? There's a lot like the intelligence service in being a meditator and practitioner of yoga. What is the goal of yoga and meditation? The goal is to discover in yourself a connection that is closer to the divinity than the human body. Getting in touch with that part of yourself, that deep part of yourself, is not unlike being an intelligence officer. An intelligence officer is living in a foreign culture when you get deeply into meditation and yoga, what you're seeing around you is not what the average person sees. You know that you're not this human body, and that most of the people around you are confused, thinking that that's what they are, this temporary body that we've been given. And to pass that on to his followers, to think like an intelligence officer. And we did that. We thought of ourselves as not the CIA, but the DCIA, the Divine Central Intelligence Officer. And we were simply here on this planet gathering information that would be of use to mankind.
In the end, Terrell stands by his statements that the myths surrounding the Finders cult are simply rumors and conspiracy theories.
There's something called Occam's razor. Are you familiar with that philosophical concept? Yeah. Occam's razor says that the simple solution is usually the best solution. These elaborate myths that have come up online from conspiracy theorists are not simple solutions, and they make no sense to a rational person, particularly when there's no evidence of any of this stuff. There's no evidence of any of this conspiracy theory, and there's no motive of why we would be trying to help the very organization that we are trying to supplant. It doesn't matter to me whether people believe that foolishness or not. I'm not trying to convince people to believe it or not believe it. If anything, I would simply say, smoke out these unconscious urges that were put there by getting you to play a role in the world rather than be yourself in the world. The training for the Finders was to smoke out the unconscious neuroses, or whatever word you want to give them, to stop playing a part that was assigned to you by your culture and be yourself. That's dangerous. It was dangerous then, it's even more dangerous now.
Although Terrell denies any truth to the child trafficking and intelligence agency allegations, his statements in our interview confirm what was reported in the anonymous investigative lead's memo. As of 2019, no member of the Finders or their children have come forward to voice complaints or admit involvement in child trafficking or sexual abuse, satanic worship, or intelligence activities. However, neither Terrell or Howell can explain why doctors with the Tallahassee Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services initially described signs of sexual abuse on 2 of the children. Nor can they explain how Raymond Martinez could imagine such detailed evidence of an international trafficking ring, including the instructions on purchasing children and nude photos of the children. Once again, in order to believe the accounts of the Finders, you must believe that Raymond Martinez imagined or faked his whole report and that the doctors mistakenly identified signs of sexual abuse, not to mention the various reports of a cover-up by the Central Intelligence Agency. So then, we must ask, who are the Finders, and what exactly were they doing? Were they truly just an eccentric group of utopian futurists being led by a charismatic former military chauffeur? Was the Finders a CIA front involved in international trafficking of children and potential blood rituals? If they were a CIA group gone rogue, at what point did they go rogue, and what did they do without the approval of the intelligence community? Or, as some have suggested, was this all one big game, one last prank from beyond the grave, courtesy of Marion D. Petty? These questions still remain unanswered. Marion Petty himself was probably operating under a NOC, a non-official cover where agents operate covertly without official ties to the intelligence community or government. If a NOC is caught violating the law, they are on their own and will not be rescued by their employer. Due to the constant moving around and the group constantly participating in games, it's possible that some members of the Finders were ignorant to the intelligence activities of the group However, it is clear that some members of the Finders formed Marion Petty's inner circle and spent their time traveling internationally, likely using journalism as a cover for intelligence activities. If these activities did involve child trafficking, the evidence is long gone, having been hidden from the public since 1987. Our goal in making this film was to expose more people to the reality of corruption and cover-ups involving law enforcement and government agencies. We hope sharing this information can help shake loose the remaining truths about the actions of Marion Petty and the Finders. Thank you for watching.